How can we be discussing basically a grandfather taking his grandchildren to court for their inheritance? These are not things that should be happening, because essentially, shouldn't your grandfather be leaving you money? Isn't that how it works? I mean, help me understand. So Herbert Wigwe is, or was, a very well-known individual in Nigerian society. He was the CEO of Access Bank, and as of the time, anyway, I believe Access Bank was the biggest African bank, and that tracks because obviously Nigeria having the most number of people in Africa, probably many of those banks make the top 5 or whatever in terms of people that are banked. So on top of that, he was also the founder of Wigwe University. And that's how I got to know about him, where somebody is doing something that is innovative in the education space. I am all about it. And it was exciting to see somebody do something so grand. We're talking about a state-of-the-art university here. And the purpose of this university was to prepare young people, young Africans, for leadership, not just leadership in terms of politics, but leadership on every level. We're talking about tech, we're talking about innovators, we're talking about people who would start companies. We were talking about really preparing the next generation to rehaul Africa, and it was exciting. And of course, we expect such things to still happen. That is his legacy. But unfortunately, we lost Herbert Wigwe in February 2024. And that's when all of this started. He created a will in 2013. And just to make sure we understood what he wanted, he revisited it in 2015 and said, this is exactly what I want to do, essentially, which was he wanted to will all of his money to his children. That was what he wanted. Now, we have a situation here where his father and cousin, I don't know where the cousin came from, but the cousin has added himself to this situation, and they are contesting the will, essentially suggesting that they should have access to, I believe it's 20% of his assets. But obviously that was not what he intended. And thankfully, Mr. Wigwe created a will that was within the legal parameters of will making in Nigeria. And so as of now, the current situation is that it has been thrown out of court. Like it's been dismissed. The case has been dismissed. There's nothing here. But my assumption is that they're probably going to appeal, but we'll see what happens. But what I find particularly interesting are the issues that this situation throws up. I think that it's quite clear that there is this kind of like concept of entitlement, especially when it comes to a parent and his child in African society. I think that's slightly more perpetuated than maybe in Western society. Let me know if you think otherwise. And maybe that's why, in a sense, the parents had this kind of thought that there's no way that this doesn't belong to us. It isn't unique to just Nigeria. So tackling this issue really should be like a global focus, and that would be difficult. So that is probably not what I'm going to focus on today. Another area that this situation throws up is the conversation around customary law and constitutional law. I think it's really important that we address this more, because I think there's a lot of misinformation when it comes to this area. We have customary law, which is Igbo customary law has its own rules and thoughts around how things should be done. And of course, then we have constitutional law, which was created specifically for the new Nigeria, as opposed to the separate entities or the separate ethnic groups and their own personal laws, which would have been customary law. Specifically in this situation, there's a misunderstanding that Igbo customary law, it tends to bypass the wife and then go to the male relatives of the deceased. That isn't technically true. Igbo customary law states that if the wife doesn't have a male heir, then yes, it goes to the brother, the father, whoever else that is basically the male relative. So there is a bit of an gender bias here. Now, In 2014, a judge declared that customary law is subject to constitutional law. So in a case where constitutional law says one thing and customary law says the opposite, constitutional law wins over. And specifically in this situation, constitutional law has something called protected characteristics. So you cannot say something can't happen to somebody based on certain protected characteristics, and in this case, gender. I think it's important to bring this out more because is there an element of customary law or thought processes playing out here? I can't say that this is what was brought to the court. I don't believe it was, probably because it wouldn't stand. But is that why perhaps his father, his siblings, and think that they have a right to his wealth? Who's to say? But I think this is quite an important point to put out there and something that we as a society need to continue to address. Another element I think would be important to address would be estate planning and how we perceive will making in general. Now, in this case, obviously, Mr. Wigwe created a will, and as a result, it's doing what it needs to do. It is essentially ensuring his desires are being carried out after death. But we live in a society where people see wills as the thing that causes death, as opposed to something that we can use to prolong our legacy, to protect our assets, to make sure that what we want to do when we are gone happens. And I think that that's the element that I'd like to address in my game plan lesson today. So how would I put together a game plan? So I'm calling lessons game plans, just because I think that when we look at education as a tool to solve our own problems, it's important that we also maybe reassess how we even come about what we're doing. So in my mind, rather than just a lesson plan, hey, this is what we're teaching people, we're going to think about it as a game plan. Basically, how are we going to get the job done? So my game plan is based on the fact that I'm trying to reassess how we see wills in our society. So how am I going to do that? Let's think about it. So there are a few options. I could use civic education. Civic education is a great thing. I think it's not taken as seriously as it should be across the world. I think for the UK, civic education comes under PSHE, which we all know we did not listen to very well. But we all seem to still pass. I don't know how that happened. The point is that civic education has so much power to actually help young people see society how they should see it. Like, we introduce them to society based on the laws, the rules, the different areas. I think that that is a really powerful tool that I think we need to rehaul and revisit. For this situation, we would use it to look at the laws of will making. How do we create a will that is watertight? How do we create a will that is airtight? How do we create a will that won't cause problems when we are gone? That would be great. English literature is also a great subject. I think people misinterpret English literature as this focus on old books, but actually, English literature is actually supposed to be a focus on ethics and values. And so ethics and values are such a key element of our society. What do we want our young people to carry away? What values underpin our society? What keeps our society going? There are so many ethics and values that underpin our society and make it run the way it does. In this particular situation, I think ethics and values would be a great way of teaching young people about wills, but then it's usually done through literature, and I would then have to find literature that covers this, and I don't know of many off the top of my head, so I would skip this, and I think my choice would be social studies. So social studies, that's a very broad term, but social studies is made up of history, sociology, anything to do with like the study of people, past, present, future. And I think here anthropology would come under here, which is the study of like human beings, and sociology is the study of like how we relate to society. I think between those two, we could come up with something called cultural studies. cultural studies in and of itself doesn't really exist anywhere by itself. But I think for a country like Nigeria, cultural studies should. There is a desperate need for cultural studies when we are trying to bring together various ethnic groups. If we want them to work together well, I think that it is really paramount that we actually put this front and center in our education system. So cultural studies is something that I think is very much something that we should consider. And so I'm going to actually use that. So almost like if I was doing a sociology lesson, if I was doing it like mixed with anthropology, something like that, I would end up with this wonderful thing called cultural studies. And in that, I think that I would be able to create what I'm trying to do. I think the focus would be on legacies and wills. That's what I would say. And that works really well in sociology. Like, what are you saying to me? I don't understand why we're not actually studying this in Nigeria. I would say that my young people should consider, the first thing I would always ask them is just a thought-provoking question. If we want everyone talking, we want everyone considering this, where there's no right or wrong answer, you're more likely, I think I found, to be able to get people's imaginations, thought processes going. And when there's no right answer, it's, I think, more of a safe space to be able to speak. So my trigger question would be, let's say, do you think wills cause death? Or do you think making a will is more likely to cause somebody to die or bring about somebody's demise more quickly? Do you think wills bring about an early death? That kind of question gets people thinking. Yes, no, why? As an educator, I am big on probing. So if you say no, I'm going to ask why. What are your thoughts around that? I'm always going to ask follow-up questions from there. I think in a society where knowledge is so easy to come about, there is a misconception that young people are therefore far more capable and as a result don't necessarily need the same level of like nurturing or whatever because, you know, there's Google. But actually, I think that we're creating a very dangerous situation because knowledge isn't the same as wisdom. Knowledge isn't the same as critical thought. Young people have more knowledge than ever, but are they wise? Are they critical in thinking? I'm not sure that they are. And as a result, we as educators really need to consider how we encourage critical thought, how we encourage young people to grow in knowledge, yes, but also wisdom. So I would always have follow-up question after follow-up question up until really the answer is I don't know. I love when young people get to the point where they don't know, because when they don't know, they are now open to learning. If we come with our preconceived notions, our ideas, everything, we kind of don't end up being open to maybe are we wrong, you know? But here I want our young people to actually consider the fact that there could be a different answer. And so that's very exciting. So that's the first thing I would do. The next thing I would move on to is actually the learning process. I think one of the things I think are important we cover, I think is important that we cover how to, what is a will? Like legally, in terms of a definition, what is a will? We'll also have to find out how can a will be structured correctly, just so that they have this initial understanding how to structure a will and make it legally valid. So we want to protect the validity. What is it that makes a will valid in Nigeria? The next thing you might want to look at would be, I think it's important that young people look at cases where a will was not made and what happened. I think a great example of that is F.R.A. Williams. That's my case study when it comes to this. You know what was really wild about F.R.A. Williams? Mr. Rotimi Williams was a legal luminary. I believe he was the first SAN of Nigeria. How he didn't make a will is the strangest thing ever. The man died at 84. He died at 84. So it wasn't that he died like young. It wasn't, I mean, we pray to live long, like, but 84 isn't short, especially in a country where the life expectancy is actually sub 60, sub 60. And then even if we look at the West, he's lived well, he had money, all of those things. The life expectancy, I think, is like 82. So he still exceeded all of those, and he still didn't think to have a will. My best guess is that he did it on purpose. He was like, these people have annoyed me, go and fight. Or the second thing would have been that perhaps he also allowed this cultural concept of wills to get the better of him. And he didn't want to bring about death by creating a will. I think also it'd be great to create parallels around the concept of how we see wills and the concept of how we see insurance. Insurance is the same thing. People don't want to get insurance for fear that means that their house will actually burn down, that the getting of insurance causes your house to burn. Yet we see people's houses burn and they don't have insurance. And at that point, I'm pretty sure they would have wished they had insurance. I think there's great parallels there. So looking at how this thought process is found, or where this thought process is found in other elements of our society. But yes, back to F.R.A. Williams, the actual idea that someone as notable as him didn't leave a will is a lesson in lessons. I am bewildered. Somebody who is a lawyer knows what wills do, and he has probably fought for a lot of people who didn't make a will and seen what it did to their family, and he didn't do it. Strange. They're still in court today, as far as I know, and he died in 2005. So I think that's a great case study for why we might want to consider how we see wills. The next thing I do is my activity. My activity would have to be at least if this was my first lesson in cultural studies. For you, this is my first lesson in cultural studies. So I think it's important that I introduce a concept that I think is really key in looking at any kind of cultural idea, cultural practice. I think a great framework when it comes to culture is the receive, reject, redeem concept. Now, this isn't new. I didn't make it up. Actually, a friend of mine at church told me about this, and this is a great way of deciding what kind of songs a church decides to incorporate into their list of songs and maybe the ones not to do. And the idea goes that what we receive are the things that we know. We've looked at the words of this song and it is wholeheartedly what we're looking for. What we reject are the ones that theologically it's unsound, and then what we redeem would be the ones where there are elements of there's something real here, there's something beautiful here, but there's other elements where we might have to change it up a little bit. I think this is a really great framework for culture. What do we want to receive? What are we going to keep? What are we keeping? I'm going to change it around, and actually the second one I would like to do is redeem. Because if we're not going to receive it as is, what elements of it might we want to keep? What elements of it might we want to throw away? What can we salvage? So I love this element because it makes young people think about, we're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. What element of our thought process when it comes to our culture do we want to keep? What elements aren't serving us? Let's throw them away. When we look at wills, would we say that it is underpinned by this idea of wanting to live long? And that's beautiful. But I think it's being perpetuated by fear, which isn't. And any cultural practice that is being perpetuated by fear really needs to be reevaluated. And so that's something young people can think about. And the other area would be to reject. Now, I'm not a fan of the idea of rejecting culture without replacing, because anything that's a vacuum fills itself, and it could fill itself with something even worse. So actually, what I would encourage is that we fill it with something that serves us. So if we say, the idea of wills being bad, or the idea of how we see wills is not great for us, what if we saw wills as a way of actually pushing legacy? It is a way of us deciding how we want to be remembered and who we think would be the responsible individual to keep our legacy going, keep our fortune going, keep whatever it is that is of importance to you going. I think that is a beautiful way to look at wills. And of course, there's no one answer. Again, it's a conversation that young people can have. So I think this is a beautiful framework for us to actually look at culture. What are we going to receive? What are we going to redeem? What are we rejecting? And then if we're rejecting it, what are we going to replace it with? And then my final element would be homework. I think homework should be something that is applicable at home. So, for example, maybe something that incorporates a conversation with a family member. I think a great idea here would be to have an interview with different people in your family that represent different generations. What would your grandfather say? What would your mother say? What would your siblings say about the idea of wills? Give them some questions and then let them see where these thoughts have come from. Who would the heroes be of this kind of problem? Who would save the day? I think one that's obvious, of course, would be estate lawyers. Perhaps people who choose to go into estate law specifically would be really great. Having more people consider that as an avenue. Maybe also, I think another element that we should consider would be arbitrators, people who would help us settle these situations outside of court. Another one would be grief counselors. Many of these situations come about because of the pain that the family is going through. And maybe if we would address that, we would then be able to solve these disputes. I think one key thing that our education system needs to do is show young people that there are so many options in terms of career paths that can solve so many different types of problems. And if you're somebody in any of these fields that I've mentioned, I would really love to hear from you. I would love for you to visit skillsmatchbyvumuye.com, a space where we are encouraging diasporans to put forward their skills to be able to meet a need. And this particular need that I'm big on is to show young people that there are so many options when it comes to careers that are solving problems for Nigeria. So if that is of any interest to you, please do check us out. Okay, until next time, bye.